Police arrest homeless veteran until they see his Medal of Honor citation. The handcuffs were already out when Officer Davis approached the park bench. Another homeless complaint, another night of paperwork, another problem that needed to be solved before the morning shift arrived. The call had come in 27 minutes ago from the manager of the downtown coffee shop, same complaint as always. Homeless man refusing to leave, making customers uncomfortable, bad for business. Officer Davis had made this walk 100 times before, down the wet sidewalk, past the closed storefronts, toward whatever unfortunate soul had chosen the wrong place to seek shelter from the Portland rain. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the figure on the bench wasn't moving as he approached. Most homeless individuals scattered when they saw a patrol car, disappearing into alleys and doorways like ghosts avoiding the light. This man just sat there, staring straight ahead, as if he was waiting for something. At 73 years old, Robert Hayes looked exactly like what society expected from a homeless veteran. His gray hair hung in wet strands around a weathered face that bore the lines of too many hard nights and too many people who looked right through him. The military jacket he wore was torn at the shoulders, faded from green to something closer to gray with patches of fabric missing entirely. His boots were held together with duct tape, and everything about him screamed the same story Officer Davis had seen countless times before. Another casualty of a system that created soldiers and then forgot about them. But what Officer Davis couldn't see, what his 12 years of police training had never prepared him to recognize, was that sitting on that bench in the rain was the most decorated combat veteran in the history of the United States Marine Corps. He couldn't see the 3 tours of duty in Vietnam, the countless nights of standing guard while teenage soldiers slept safely in their foxholes. He couldn't see the moment when this man had thrown himself between an enemy grenade and a group of kids who were about to die. He couldn't see the 47 American lives those weathered hands had saved in a single afternoon of hell. All Officer Davis saw was another homeless problem that needed to be moved along. "Good evening, Sir," Davis called out as he approached, his hand resting on his radio. "I'm going to need you to move along. You can't sleep here." Robert Hayes looked up slowly, rain dripping from his gray beard. His eyes held something that Davis couldn't quite identify. Not defiance, not anger, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like resignation mixed with a sadness that seemed to go back decades. "I'm not sleeping, officer," Robert said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of rain hitting the pavement. "Just sitting, waiting for the library to open." Davis checked his watch. It was 3:17 a.m. The library wouldn't open for another 6 hours, and they both knew it. "Sir, I've received complaints about you disturbing the peace. I'm going to need to see some identification." Robert reached slowly into his jacket pocket, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that sudden movements around police officers could be dangerous. But as his fingers searched through the torn fabric, Davis noticed something he hadn't seen before. The way Robert moved, there was something almost military about it. The straightness of his posture despite his apparent exhaustion. The way he kept his hands visible and moved with purpose rather than the erratic gestures Davis usually saw from homeless individuals struggling with mental illness or addiction. "I don't have ID," Robert said finally. "Lost my wallet last week when someone broke into my tent under the bridge." Davis sighed. This was going exactly like every other homeless encounter he'd ever had. No identification, no permanent address, no way to verify anything the man claimed. Standard procedure was simple: arrest for vagrancy, transport to jail, process and release in the morning. It was a cycle that repeated itself endlessly, solving nothing but creating the paperwork that proved the police department was doing something about the homeless problem. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stand up and put your hands behind your back." Robert Hayes rose from the bench slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. As he stood, Davis noticed that despite his apparent frailty, there was something solid about the man, something that suggested strength hidden beneath the weathered exterior. Robert placed his hands behind his back without being asked, as if he'd done this before. The handcuffs clicked shut around wrists that had once carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire, through mud and blood and chaos that would haunt lesser men for the rest of their lives. But Officer Davis didn't know any of that. He saw what he expected to see: another routine arrest, another homeless veteran processed through a system that had no real solutions to offer. As Davis began the standard search for weapons or contraband, his hands moved methodically through Robert's pockets. The jacket was soaked through, and everything inside felt damp and fragile. In the left pocket he found a plastic spoon, a handful of crackers wrapped in napkins, and what felt like medication bottles. Standard homeless inventory, the small collection of items that represented everything a person owned in the world. But when Davis reached into the right pocket, his fingers brushed against something different, something wrapped in plastic, protected from the rain like it was more valuable than anything else Robert owned. It felt like paper, but paper that had been preserved with the kind of care usually reserved for important documents, birth certificates maybe, or social security cards. Davis pulled out the plastic-wrapped bundle, and even in the dim streetlight, he could see that whatever was inside had been protected and maintained with obsessive care. The plastic was clear, and through it, he could make out official-looking text and what appeared to be a government seal. "What's this?" Davis asked, holding up the bundle. Robert's voice was so quiet that Davis had to strain to hear it over the rain. "That's my citation, officer, from Vietnam." Davis felt something shift in his chest, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. He'd seen plenty of military paperwork from homeless veterans: discharge papers, service records, VA documents. Most of it was legitimate, though occasionally someone would try to pass off forged documents to gain sympathy or avoid arrest. But something about the way Robert had said those words, the reverence in his voice when he called it his citation, made Davis pause. Carefully, Davis peeled back the plastic wrapping, trying to protect the document from the rain. As the text became visible under the streetlight, his eyes widened. This wasn't a standard discharge paper or service record. The official seal at the top was unmistakable, the Great Seal of the United States. And the words that followed made Davis's hands begin to tremble. Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded to Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes, United States Marine Corps, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Davis stopped reading and looked up at the man standing in handcuffs in front of him. The most decorated living war hero in American history was shivering in the rain, waiting to be arrested for the crime of having nowhere else to go. What Davis read next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The citation described actions that seemed impossible, heroism that belonged in movies rather than real life. Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes had been leading a patrol through the Mekong Delta when they stumbled into an ambush. 47 American soldiers pinned down by enemy fire, with no escape route and reinforcements hours away. Robert had been wounded twice, bleeding from shrapnel wounds that should have incapacitated him. But instead of seeking cover, instead of waiting for help, he had done something that defied every instinct for self-preservation. He had charged the enemy position alone. For 6 hours, Robert Hayes had held off an entire North Vietnamese company by himself, using captured weapons when his own ammunition ran out, dragging wounded soldiers to safety one by one, while enemy bullets tore through the jungle around him. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found Robert unconscious from blood loss, still gripping a rifle, still guarding the improvised field hospital he'd created in a bomb crater where 47 wounded Americans waited for salvation. Davis read the words twice, then 3 times, unable to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just any veteran. This wasn't just any war story. This was the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, awarded for valor in action against an enemy force. Only 3,522 people in American history had ever received it, and one of them was standing in handcuffs in front of him, being arrested for vagrancy. "Sir," Davis said, his voice cracking slightly. "Sir, I need to ask you something. Is this real?" Robert looked up, and for the first time that night, Davis saw something different in his eyes. Not resignation, not sadness, but a quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside. "It's real, officer. Earned it on March 15, 1971. President Nixon put it around my neck himself." Davis felt the world shift around him. Everything he thought he knew about this arrest, about this man, about what it meant to be a hero, suddenly rearranged itself in his mind. He was looking at living history, a man whose actions had saved nearly 50 American lives, whose story belonged in textbooks and museums, not in a police report for vagrancy. But the night was far from over. What happened next would transform not just Officer Davis, but an entire police department, and ultimately remind a whole city about the true meaning of honor and sacrifice. Davis keyed his radio with shaking hands. "Dispatch, this is Unit 23. I need a supervisor at my location immediately." The radio crackled back. "Unit 23, what's the nature of your request?" Davis looked at Robert, still standing patiently in handcuffs, water dripping from his gray hair. "How do you explain to a dispatcher that you've just arrested a Medal of Honor recipient? How do you put into words that you're holding one of America's greatest heroes for the crime of being homeless?" "Just send Sergeant Morrison," Davis said finally. "Tell him it's urgent." While they waited for the supervisor to arrive, Davis found himself studying Robert with new eyes. The military bearing he'd noticed earlier now made perfect sense. The way Robert had cooperated without resistance, the dignity with which he'd accepted arrest, these weren't the actions of a career criminal or a mentally ill vagrant. These were the actions of a disciplined soldier who understood chain of command and respect for authority, even when that authority was making a terrible mistake. "Tell me about Vietnam," Davis said quietly. Robert was silent for a long moment, staring out into the rain. Most people didn't want to hear about Vietnam. For 50 years, he'd carried those stories alone, locked away in a part of his mind that he rarely allowed himself to visit. The nightmares, the faces of the men he'd saved, the faces of the men he couldn't save. It was all still there, as vivid as the day it happened. "It was a long time ago, officer," Robert said finally. "Different world back then." But Davis pressed on. "The citation says you saved 47 men. How does someone do something like that?" Robert turned to look at him, and Davis saw something in those eyes that he'd never seen before. It wasn't pride or boastfulness. It was something much deeper, the quiet certainty of someone who had faced the worst humanity could offer and had chosen to respond with the best of what he had to give. "You don't think about it," Robert said. "You just see people who need help, and you help them. Same as you'd do if you saw someone drowning or trapped in a burning building. You don't think about the danger. You think about getting them home to their families." The simplicity of the answer struck Davis like a physical blow. Here was a man who had performed actions that most people couldn't even imagine, and he described it like helping someone change a tire. No drama, no heroics, just duty and compassion and a willingness to sacrifice everything for others. That's when Sergeant Morrison arrived, his patrol car pulling up behind Davis's vehicle with emergency lights flashing. Morrison was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man who prided himself on having seen everything there was to see in police work. But he wasn't prepared for what Davis was about to show him. "What's the situation, Davis?" Morrison called out as he approached. Davis held up the Medal of Honor citation, still wrapped in its protective plastic. "Sarge, I need you to look at this." Morrison took the document and began reading, his expression changing from impatience to confusion to something approaching awe. As the words sank in, he looked up at Robert, then back at the citation, then at Robert again. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "This is real?" "It's real," Davis confirmed. "I've got the Medal of Honor recipient in handcuffs for vagrancy." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing what he was seeing. In 20 years of police work, he'd arrested drug dealers and murderers, bank robbers and gang members, but he'd never arrested a living legend. He'd never put handcuffs on someone whose story belonged in the Smithsonian. "Sir," Morrison said to Robert, his voice filled with a respect that hadn't been there moments before. "Sir, we're going to remove those handcuffs right now." As the metal restraints fell away from Robert's wrists, something changed in the air around the three men. The dynamic had shifted completely. This was no longer an arrest. This was no longer about vagrancy or disturbing the peace. This was about recognition, about respect, and about the debt that a grateful nation owed to those who had served. But Morrison wasn't finished. He keyed his radio, broadcasting on a frequency that reached every patrol car in the district. All units, all units. This is Sergeant Morrison. I need every available officer to respond to my location for a special detail. We have a Medal of Honor recipient who needs our assistance. The response was immediate. Within 15 minutes, 8 patrol cars had arrived at the scene, their red and blue lights turning the rainy street into something that looked almost festive. Officers stepped out of their vehicles, expecting to find a dangerous situation or a major crime scene. Instead, they found their sergeant and 2 fellow officers standing in respectful silence around an elderly homeless man who looked like he might blow away in the wind. Morrison addressed the assembled officers, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the magnitude of what was happening. "Officers, I want you to meet Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes, United States Marine Corps, Medal of Honor recipient. This man saved 47 American lives in Vietnam. He is a living piece of American history, and he's been living on our streets." The silence that followed was profound. These were hardened police officers, men and women who dealt with violence and tragedy every day. But looking at Robert, seeing the quiet dignity with which he stood despite his circumstances, they understood that they were in the presence of something rare and precious. Officer Martinez was the first to speak. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to shake your hand." Robert nodded, and one by one each officer approached him. They shook his hand, thanked him for his service, and listened as Morrison read excerpts from the Medal of Honor citation. Some of the younger officers had never heard of actions like those described in the document. The idea that one man could hold off an entire enemy company, could save 47 lives while wounded and outnumbered, seemed like something from a movie. But here was the man who had done it, standing in the rain without complaint, accepting their thanks with the same quiet grace he'd shown when being arrested. Officer Johnson, who had been with the department for only 2 years, raised his hand hesitantly. "Sir, I have to ask, how did you end up homeless? Someone with your record, your service, there should be programs, benefits, support systems." Robert's smile was sad but not bitter. "The system's complicated, son. Sometimes people fall through the cracks. Sometimes the nightmares are worse than sleeping under a bridge. Sometimes it's easier to be invisible than to explain why you wake up screaming." The honesty of the answer hit every officer present. They'd all seen homeless veterans, had arrested them, processed them, released them back onto the streets. But they'd never really understood the journey that brought someone from the halls of Congress, where Medal of Honor recipients were honored, to a park bench where they were arrested for existing. That's when Morrison made a decision that would change everything. "Gentlemen," he announced to his officers, "this situation ends tonight. Staff Sergeant Hayes is not going to spend another night on the streets. Not in my district, not on my watch." But it wasn't just about one night's shelter. Morrison was thinking bigger, understanding that they had an opportunity to do something meaningful, something that went beyond police work and touched on basic human decency. "Davis, I want you to contact the VA Homeless Outreach Program." "Johnson, call the mayor's office. I don't care that it's 4 in the morning. Wake someone up." "Martinez, get in touch with the local VFW and American Legion posts." "Thompson, call the media. This story needs to be told." As the officers dispersed to make their calls, Morrison turned back to Robert. "Sir, I need to ask you something. What do you need? What would help you get back on your feet?" Robert was quiet for a moment, seemingly overwhelmed by the sudden attention and care. For years, he'd been invisible, ignored, forgotten. Now, in the span of an hour, he was surrounded by people who wanted to help. "I just need a chance, officer. A place to clean up. Maybe some help navigating the VA system. I've got medical issues, PTSD, things that make it hard to advocate for myself. I'm not asking for charity. I just need someone to help me access the benefits I earned." What Robert didn't know was that his night of recognition was just beginning. The calls Morrison's officers were making would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just his life, but the way an entire community thought about veterans and homelessness. The first call to bear fruit was Martinez's contact with the local VFW post. The post commander, himself a Vietnam veteran, answered his phone on the second ring. When Martinez explained the situation, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You're telling me you've got a Medal of Honor recipient living on the streets?" the commander said finally. "Where is he?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes. True to his word, Commander Wilson arrived exactly 20 minutes later, driving through the rain in his pickup truck with a VFW flag mounted in the bed. He was a man in his 70s, wearing a baseball cap covered with military pins and a jacket that had seen better days. But when he approached Robert, his bearing was unmistakably military. "Staff Sergeant Hayes," Commander Wilson said, rendering a crisp salute. "It's an honor to meet you, sir." Robert returned the salute with movements that were still sharp despite his years on the streets. The gesture seemed to unlock something in him, reminding him of who he was beneath the weathered exterior and torn clothes. "Thank you, Commander," Robert replied. "It's good to see another veteran." Wilson's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the Medal of Honor citation that Morrison handed him. He read it silently, his lips moving as he processed the magnitude of what Robert had accomplished. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Wilson whispered. 47 families who got their boys back because of you." He turned to Morrison and the assembled officers. "Gentlemen, this man is not spending another night on the streets. The VFW has emergency housing funds for exactly this situation. We'll get him into a motel tonight, and tomorrow we start working on permanent solutions." But Wilson wasn't finished. He pulled out his cell phone and began making calls, waking up VFW members across the city. Within an hour, a small convoy of vehicles had arrived at the scene, pickup trucks driven by grizzled veterans, each one eager to help one of their own. The scene that unfolded next would be talked about in police circles for years to come. A dozen veterans, ranging in age from their 40s to their 80s, formed an honor guard around Robert. They presented him with a new jacket, dry clothes, and a warm meal that someone had brought from an all-night diner. But more importantly, they surrounded him with something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. As Robert changed into clean, dry clothes in the back of one of the patrol cars, Officer Davis found himself reflecting on what the night had taught him. He'd started his shift thinking he knew what heroism looked like. He'd expected it to be young and strong and easily recognizable. Instead, he'd learned that heroes could be old and broken and invisible, that courage didn't always announce itself with fanfare and flags. When Robert emerged from the patrol car, he looked like a different man. The clean clothes revealed a frame that was still solid despite his age, and his eyes seemed clearer, more focused. But the most significant change was in his posture. He stood straighter, moved with more confidence, carried himself like the decorated Marine he had always been. Commander Wilson approached him with one final gesture. From a small wooden box, he pulled out a pair of Marine Corps dress blue-collar insignia, the bronze eagle, globe, and anchor that marked Robert's service branch. "Staff Sergeant," Wilson said formally, "these belong to you." As Wilson pinned the insignia to Robert's new jacket, something remarkable happened. The assembled police officers, without any prompting or command, came to attend. It wasn't a formal military ceremony, but it was recognition of something important, something that transcended rank and branch of service and time. In that moment, standing in the rain surrounded by police officers and fellow veterans, Robert Hayes was no longer a homeless man who had been forgotten by society. He was what he had always been: a Marine, a hero, a man who had given everything in service to his country. But the transformation wasn't just in Robert. Every person present that night had been changed by what they'd witnessed. The police officers had learned that heroism comes in many forms, that service continues long after the uniform comes off, and that sometimes the most important arrests are the ones you don't make. The veterans had been reminded of their obligation to take care of their own, and the power of brotherhood to heal wounds that time alone couldn't touch. And Robert had rediscovered something he'd lost years ago on the streets: his identity as more than just a casualty of war, more than just a problem to be solved. He was a Marine, and Marines take care of them. As the night wound down and the various groups began to disperse, Morrison approached Robert one final time. He handed him a business card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. "Staff Sergeant," Morrison said, "if you ever need anything at all, you call me." "That's not just from me, that's from the entire department. We serve this community, And that includes taking care of the people who served our country. Robert took the card and looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up at Morrison, and for the first time that night he smiled. "Thank you, officer," Robert said. "All of you. You've given me something tonight that I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Morrison asked. "Hope," Robert replied simply. As the last patrol car drove away and the veterans loaded Robert into their convoy bound for a warm motel room, Officer Davis found himself sitting alone in his patrol car, trying to process what had just happened. He'd started his shift expecting to arrest a vagrant. Instead, he'd met a living legend and been part of something that felt more like a rescue mission than police work. He picked up his radio and called dispatch. "Unit 23 to dispatch. Go ahead, Unit 23. The homeless complaint has been resolved. No arrest necessary. Situation handled with assistance from community partners." As he drove back toward his normal patrol area, Davis realized that the night had taught him something fundamental about police work, about service, and about recognizing the dignity in every person he encountered. He would never look at a homeless veteran the same way again. None of them would. 6 months later, Robert Hayes would be living in a small apartment provided by the VA, receiving the medical care and benefits he'd earned through his service. He would become a regular speaker at schools and community events, sharing his story and educating young people about the cost of freedom. The Medal of Honor citation that had been wrapped in plastic to protect it from the rain would be properly framed and displayed in the local VFW post, where it would remind future generations of veterans about the importance of taking care of their own. But perhaps most importantly, Robert's story would change how the police department approached homeless outreach. Officer Davis would become a specialist in veteran services, learning to recognize signs of PTSD and military training in the people he encountered on the street. The department would partner with veteran organizations to create programs that treated homeless veterans not as problems to be solved, but as heroes who needed support. And late at night, when Officer Davis drove past that park bench where he'd first encountered Robert Hayes, he would remember the lesson he'd learned about looking beyond appearances to see the person underneath. He would remember that heroes don't always announce themselves, that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off, and that sometimes the most important thing a police officer can do is recognize when someone needs help instead of handcuffs. The rain continued to fall on Portland that night, washing the streets clean and carrying away the evidence of what had transpired. But the memory of what happened would endure in the hearts and minds of everyone who had been present. They had witnessed something rare and beautiful. The moment when a forgotten hero was remembered, when a community came together to care for one of its own, and when the true meaning of service was honored in the way it always should be. Robert Hayes had saved 47 lives in a jungle in Vietnam 50 years earlier. But on this rainy night in Portland, those lives had been returned to him in the form of recognition, respect, and hope. And in the end, that might have been the most important rescue of all. If you believe that honor doesn't expire with age, that heroes walk among us in forms we might not recognize, and that sometimes the greatest service we can provide is simply seeing the dignity in every person we meet, then this story matters. Because at the end of the day, we're all responsible for taking care of each other, especially those who have already given everything in service to something greater than themselves. The handcuffs had been removed, but more importantly, the invisible chains of neglect and indifference had been broken. And sometimes, that's what real justice looks like.